The three words that shattered a billionaire's world came from the last person he'd ever expect to understand them. Rashid al-Mansouri had just finished dismissing the waitress in Arabic, calling her beautiful but empty-headed, probably illiterate despite her American education. When Brielle Cassidy looked him dead in the eye and responded in flawless Arabic, "Perhaps you should be more careful with your words when you assume people can't understand them." The crystal glass slipped from her trembling hands, exploding against marble like a gunshot through Manhattan's most exclusive restaurant. Every conversation stopped, every head turned, and in that moment of perfect silence, a Georgetown-educated diplomatic consultant disguised as invisible help realized she held the power to destroy a tech empire built on assumptions, arrogance, and illegal insider trading. Hit that subscribe button because what happens next will make you believe in justice again. And you won't want to miss how a brilliant woman turns one moment of disrespect into the most satisfying takedown in corporate history. Brielle's hands trembled as she balanced the tray of champagne flutes, each one worth more than her monthly rent. The penthouse restaurant hummed with the quiet power of old money and new tech fortunes. She'd worked here for 3 months, invisible to men in $1,000 suits who discussed million-dollar deals over her head. Tonight felt different, though. The man at table 12, Rashid al-Mansouri, according to the reservation, had been watching her with cold calculation. When she approached with his order, he leaned toward his business partner and spoke in rapid Arabic, his voice dripping with contempt. Brielle's blood turned to ice. She understood every poisonous word, every cruel assumption about her intelligence, her worth, her place in their world. The crystal glass slipped from her fingers, shattering against marble like her last thread of patience. The sound of breaking crystal echoed through Celestial's dining room like a gunshot, but Brielle barely heard it. Her mind was still processing the Arabic words that had just sliced through her consciousness like a blade. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because this story is about to get very real. Very fast. She stood frozen among the scattered shards, watching champagne pool around her black slip-resistant shoes, the only pair she owned that could handle 12-hour shifts on marble floors. The golden liquid reflected the ambient lighting from the Manhattan skyline beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, creating tiny mirrors that seemed to mock her with their brilliance. Around her, the soft murmur of conversations continued, uninterrupted. The wealthy patrons of Celestial were accustomed to servants making mistakes, and this was merely another invisible girl having an invisible moment of clumsiness. Brielle had mastered the art of invisibility over her 3 months at Celestial. She moved through the space like a ghost, refilling water glasses and clearing plates while men in bespoke suits negotiated deals worth more than most people earned in a lifetime. Her Georgetown degree in international relations hung framed in her studio apartment 15 subway stops away, gathering dust beside her diplomatic training certificates and language proficiency awards. But here, in the rarefied air of Manhattan's elite, she was simply another pretty face serving overpriced food to people who saw her as part of the furniture. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd spent 4 years studying the intricacies of Middle Eastern politics and culture, only to end up serving Middle Eastern billionaires who assumed she couldn't count to 10 in their native tongue. The Ohio factory worker's daughter had come a long way from her childhood home in Akron, where her father's hands were permanently stained with machine oil, and her mother graded papers at the kitchen table every night until midnight. They'd sacrificed everything to send her to Georgetown, taking out a second mortgage and working overtime shifts that aged them beyond their years. Brielle carried their dreams in her chest like a weight, feeling the pressure of their expectations with every step she took through Celestial's opulent dining room. She'd graduated summa cum laude, spent a semester in Cairo perfecting her Arabic, and completed internships at the State Department that should have launched her into a prestigious diplomatic career. Instead, she was 26 years old and serving wine to people who made more in an hour than her parents made in a year. The student loans were crushing her slowly, like being buried alive one payment at a time. $47,000 in debt for an education that had qualified her to work 3 jobs just to afford rent in a city that chewed up dreamers and spat out cynics. She worked mornings at a coffee shop in Midtown, afternoons doing freelance translation work when she could find it, and evenings at Celestial, where the tips were good enough to keep her head barely above water. The diplomatic consulting firms all wanted experience she couldn't get without connections she didn't have, creating a perfect circle of professional purgatory that trapped ambitious graduates like flies in amber. She told herself it was temporary, that something would break, that her language skills and academic achievements would eventually open the right door. Trevor Hamilton appeared beside her with the efficiency of a man who'd spent 15 years managing crisis situations in high-end hospitality. The restaurant manager was 42 years old and carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who understood that discretion was more valuable than gold in Manhattan's elite dining scene. His silver-threaded hair was perfectly styled, his charcoal suit immaculate, and his expression revealed nothing as he surveyed the champagne disaster at table 12. Brielle had learned to read his moods through the subtle tightening around his eyes, and tonight she could see the calculation happening behind his professional mask. A broken glass was replaceable, but upset billionaires were bad for business, and Rashid al-Mansouri was the kind of client who could destroy a restaurant's reputation with a single phone call. Brielle knelt to collect the larger pieces of crystal, her movements careful and precise, despite the tremor in her hands. She could feel Rashid's eyes on her, cold and dismissive, as if she were a malfunctioning piece of equipment that needed to be discarded. The shame burned in her chest, not because she'd made a mistake, but because she understood exactly what he thought of her. The Arabic phrases echoed in her mind, each word a small violence against her dignity. He'd called her beautiful but empty-headed, a decoration with no substance, probably illiterate despite her obvious American education. The assumptions stung because they were so carelessly made, so confidently delivered, as if her humanity was something he could evaluate and dismiss with a glance. The other patrons had returned to their conversations, the brief excitement of broken glass already forgotten in the endless pursuit of their own importance. But Brielle felt the weight of the moment settling into her bones, crystallizing into something harder and more dangerous than embarrassment. She'd spent months being invisible, months swallowing small humiliations and casual dismissals, months pretending that her education and abilities didn't matter as long as the tips paid her bills. But hearing her worth calculated and dismissed in a language he assumed she couldn't understand had awakened something fierce and uncompromising in her chest. As she placed the crystal shards on her tray, she made a decision that would change everything. She was done being invisible. Rashid al-Mansouri commanded attention without effort, the way gravity commands objects to fall. At 35, he possessed the kind of wealth that bent reality around him, making ordinary people feel smaller simply by existing in his presence. His custom-tailored Tom Ford suit probably cost more than Brielle's annual salary, and his Patek Philippe watch caught the restaurant's ambient lighting like captured starlight. He'd built his tech empire through a combination of brilliance, ruthlessness, and an ability to see opportunities where others saw obstacles. Forbes had featured him on 3 covers, and his company's latest acquisition had made international headlines for its scope and audacity. Tonight, he was courting James Crawford, a venture capitalist whose approval could unlock the next phase of his global expansion. The conversation required delicacy, strategy, and absolute privacy, which was why he'd chosen to conduct it in Arabic. James Crawford represented old American money, the kind that had been accumulating compound interest since before the Civil War. His family's investment firm managed assets worth more than some countries' GDP, and his personal portfolio included everything from Manhattan real estate to African diamond mines. At 58, Crawford had the weathered face of a man who'd negotiated deals on 6 continents and the quiet confidence that came from never needing to prove his worth to anyone. He spoke 3 languages fluently, but had never bothered to learn Arabic, a fact that Rashid had noted and filed away for future use. The ability to communicate freely in front of potential eavesdroppers was invaluable in their line of work, where a carelessly overheard phrase could trigger SEC investigations or hostile takeover attempts. Brielle approached their table with the practiced grace of someone who'd learned to move through spaces where she didn't belong. Her black uniform was simple but elegant, designed to ensure service staff blended into the background while maintaining the restaurant's aesthetic standards. She'd tied her auburn hair back in a neat bun, applied minimal makeup, and adopted the pleasant but unremarkable expression that wealthy customers expected from their servers. The champagne order was straightforward. Dom Perignon, 2012 for the table, with specific instructions about the temperature and presentation that spoke to Rashid's exacting standards. She moved efficiently, professionally, giving no indication that she understood the Arabic conversation unfolding before her with crystalline clarity. The business discussion centered around a hostile takeover that would destroy a family-owned tech startup in Austin, Texas. Rashid described the founders with casual cruelty, noting their emotional attachment to a company they'd built from nothing as a weakness he intended to exploit. The startup had developed revolutionary software for sustainable energy management, but they lacked the capital to scale globally and the political connections to navigate international markets. Rashid's plan was elegant in its brutality: offer them a partnership, gain access to their intellectual property, then systematically undercut their market position until they had no choice but to sell at a fraction of their company's true value. Crawford listened with the detached interest of a surgeon observing a particularly complex operation, occasionally asking questions about regulatory implications and timeline logistics. As Brielle arranged the champagne service with meticulous attention to detail, Rashid's conversation shifted to more personal observations about American culture and the people he encountered in his business dealings. His voice carried the casual arrogance of someone accustomed to speaking freely without consequence, and his assessment of the restaurant staff was particularly cutting. He noted how American service workers maintained pleasant facades while secretly resenting the wealth they served, how they smiled and nodded while harboring revolutionary fantasies about redistributing his hard-earned fortune. The conversation took a darker turn when he began commenting specifically about the wait staff, analyzing their backgrounds and motivations with the clinical detachment of an entomologist studying insects. When Rashid's attention focused on Brielle specifically, his words became a scalpel dissecting her presumed psychology and capabilities. He observed her careful movements, her professional demeanor, her obvious American education, and constructed an elaborate narrative about her life and limitations. She was probably from some middle-class family that had overextended themselves to send her to a mediocre college, where she'd studied something impractical like art history or communications. Her beauty was her only real asset, he explained to Crawford, and she'd learned to leverage it for tips while secretly hoping some wealthy patron would rescue her from a life of service. The cruelest cut came when he suggested that despite her obvious American education, she probably couldn't read anything more complex than a restaurant menu, let alone understand the sophisticated business discussions happening around her. The Arabic flowed between them like poisoned honey, each phrase carefully constructed to demonstrate Rashid's cultural superiority while reinforcing Crawford's position as an honorary insider worthy of such confidential observations. They discussed the broader implications of American educational decline, the way democratic societies produce citizens who are technically literate but fundamentally ignorant of global realities. Rashid positioned himself as a bridge between worlds, someone who understood both Eastern sophistication and Western commerce well enough to profit from the gaps between them. His company's success stemmed partly from his ability to navigate cultural differences that remained invisible to his American competitors, and he intended to leverage that advantage in the Austin acquisition. Brielle's hands remained steady as she completed the champagne service, but inside her chest, something fundamental was crystallizing into diamond-hard resolve. Every word she understood, every assumption she cataloged, every casual cruelty she absorbed was being filed away for future reference. Her Georgetown education hadn't prepared her for this particular form of violence, but her diplomatic training had taught her to observe, analyze, and wait for the perfect moment to deploy her advantages. As she placed the final glass before Crawford and stepped back into her assigned invisibility, she carried with her a complete understanding of their illegal business plan, their personal prejudices, and their absolute confidence that no one around them possessed the intelligence or education to threaten their carefully constructed world of privilege and exploitation. The weight of Rashid's words had been accumulating in Brielle's chest like pressure in a diving bell, And when he made his final observation about her intellectual capacity, something fundamental snapped. She'd been returning to their table with a fresh bottle of mineral water when she heard him tell Crawford in Arabic that she probably never seen the inside of a university, despite her obvious attempts to appear educated and sophisticated. The casual certainty in his voice, the way he dismissed her entire existence with such confident ignorance, sent a shock wave through her nervous system that loosened her grip on everything she'd been holding. The crystal glass containing ice water seemed to fall in slow motion, its trajectory toward the marble floor as inevitable as gravity itself. And in that suspended moment between accident and consequence, Brielle felt the last threads of her professional composure dissolving like sugar in rain. The sound of shattering crystal cut through the restaurant's ambient murmur like a conductor's baton demanding attention. And suddenly, every conversation in Celestial paused for the briefest moment before resuming with the practiced indifference of people accustomed to service staff making mistakes. Brielle stood frozen above the wreckage, watching champagne and ice water mix with glass fragments in a pattern that seemed almost artistic in its chaos. Her black uniform was splashed with liquid, her composure was destroyed, and her carefully maintained professional facade had cracked as thoroughly as the crystal at her feet. She could feel heat rising in her cheeks, not from embarrassment at the accident, but from 3 months of accumulated frustration finally finding its breaking point in this moment of perfect symbolic destruction. Rashid's reaction was immediate and cutting, his English suddenly perfect and precise as he addressed the situation with the same casual authority he'd used to dismiss a malfunctioning piece of equipment. He called for Trevor Hamilton with the impatient tone of someone accustomed to having problems solved quickly and efficiently, his voice carrying across the dining room with enough volume to ensure that nearby tables could witness his handling of the incompetent help. When the manager appeared with his characteristic blend of professionalism and quiet alarm, Rashid launched into a detailed critique of Brielle's performance that was clearly designed to result in her immediate termination. She was clumsy, unprofessional, and obviously unsuited for service in an establishment that catered to discerning international clientele who expected excellence in every aspect of their dining experience. Trevor's response was everything Rashid expected: apologetic, deferential, and immediately focused on damage control rather than fact-finding or employee protection. The manager's 15 years in high-end hospitality had taught him that wealthy customers were always right, even when they were wrong, and that a server who upset a billionaire was a server who needed to find new employment. He began the familiar ritual of corporate placation, offering to comp their entire meal, personally oversee their service for the remainder of the evening, and ensure that the problematic employee would face appropriate consequences. Brielle watched this performance with growing fury, recognizing the casual way her livelihood was being negotiated away by men who saw her as a replaceable component in their elaborate machinery of privilege and consumption. The moment when everything changed came not through careful planning or strategic thinking, but through pure emotional combustion that bypassed her diplomatic training and professional caution entirely. As Trevor began his apology and Rashid expanded his critique to include broader observations about American service standards, something in Brielle's chest caught fire and burned away every rational consideration about student loans, rent payments, and career consequences. The Arabic words emerged from her mouth with perfect pronunciation and flawless grammar, cutting through the English conversation like a sword through silk. Perhaps you should be more careful with your words when you assume people can't understand them. The phrase hung in the air between them like smoke from an explosion, and the silence that followed was so complete that Brielle could hear her own heartbeat echoing in her ears. Rashid's face underwent a transformation that would have been comical in different circumstances, his expression shifting from arrogant dismissal to genuine shock, to something approaching panic as the implications of her response registered in his mind. His carefully constructed world of assumptions had just collapsed like a house of cards in an earthquake, and he found himself staring at a woman who possessed capabilities he'd never bothered to consider. Crawford leaned forward with the sharp attention of someone who recognized that the dynamics of their conversation had just shifted in ways that could prove either entertaining or dangerous, depending on how the situation developed. Trevor's professional mask slipped for just a moment, revealing genuine confusion as he tried to process what had just happened and calculate its potential impact on his carefully managed dining room. The words continued to flow from Brielle's mouth as if a dam had burst, her years of diplomatic training finally finding their voice in the most unlikely of circumstances. She explained in crisp, precise English that she held a degree in international relations from Georgetown University, had completed advanced diplomatic training programs, and possessed fluency in 4 languages including Arabic, which she'd studied for 2 years including a semester in Cairo. Her academic credentials were accompanied by internships at the State Department and translation work for international consulting firms, experiences that had given her intimate familiarity with Middle Eastern business practices and cultural nuances. The revelation emerged not as a boast, but as a statement of fact, delivered with the quiet authority of someone who no longer cared about the consequences of being seen and understood. Rashid's recovery was swift and predictable, his shock quickly metamorphosing into defensive anger as he attempted to regain control of a situation that had spiraled beyond his expectations. He dismissed her claims as obvious fabrication, the desperate lies of a service worker trying to save her job through elaborate deception and manipulation. His voice carried the cutting edge of someone who'd built an empire by never backing down from challenges to his authority, and he suggested that her little performance was proof of exactly the kind of cunning dishonesty that made American service workers so fundamentally untrustworthy. The fact that she'd been eavesdropping on private conversations was grounds for immediate termination and possibly legal action, he informed Trevor, who was looking increasingly uncomfortable as the confrontation escalated beyond the boundaries of normal customer service disputes. But even as Rashid dismissed her revelations and demanded her immediate firing, Brielle could see something new in his eyes that hadn't been there before. The uncomfortable recognition that his assumptions might have been wrong, and that the intellectual landscape of their encounter was far more complex than he'd originally calculated. The glass had broken, literally and metaphorically, and there was no way to reassemble the pieces into their original configuration. As Trevor struggled to navigate between his wealthy customer's demands and the growing realization that his employee might not be the simple target Rashid had assumed, Brielle stood among the crystal fragments and felt something powerful awakening in her chest. She was done being invisible, done being dismissed, and done pretending that her education and abilities didn't matter. The conversation was far from over, and the real battle was just beginning. The suspension came with all the bureaucratic efficiency that Trevor Hamilton had perfected over his 15 years managing high-end hospitality disasters. Brielle found herself in his office 30 minutes after the confrontation, listening to carefully worded explanations about customer service standards, professional behavior expectations, and the regrettable necessity of administrative leave pending a full investigation. The language was corporate neutral, designed to protect Celestial from lawsuits while avoiding any direct admission that they were firing her for standing up to a wealthy customer's racism. Trevor's discomfort was visible in the way he avoided eye contact, shuffling papers unnecessarily and speaking in the clipped tone of someone who knew he was enforcing an injustice but felt powerless to prevent it. The mathematics of Manhattan dining were brutal and simple. Billionaire customers were irreplaceable. Waitresses were not. The financial implications hit Brielle like a physical blow as she cleaned out her locker and surrendered her uniform in the staff changing room that smelled of industrial detergent and broken dreams. Celestial had provided nearly 40% of her monthly income, and losing those shifts would create a cascading crisis that would affect everything from her rent payment to her student loan obligations. She'd been living paycheck to paycheck with mathematical precision, balancing coffee shop wages against translation work against restaurant tips in a delicate equation that barely kept her above the poverty line. Without Celestial's income, she had perhaps 6 weeks before the financial walls closed in completely, forcing her to choose between eating and maintaining her tiny studio apartment 15 subway stops from the life she dreamed of building in Manhattan. The subway ride home felt like a journey through the circles of hell, each stop carrying her further from the world of wealth and power and deeper into the reality of being a failed idealist with expensive tastes and empty pockets. She stared at her reflection in the train window, seeing not the Georgetown graduate with diplomatic training, but a 26-year-old woman whose dreams had just collided with the immutable laws of economic gravity. The other passengers around her were mostly service workers heading home from their own versions of invisible labor. Building maintenance, food delivery, retail sales, all the jobs that kept Manhattan functioning while remaining completely beneath the notice of people like Rashid al-Mansouri. She'd spent 3 months thinking she was different from them, that her education and abilities made her temporary situation somehow more noble or justified. But tonight, she understood with crystalline clarity that intelligence and credentials meant nothing without money and connections. Back in her studio apartment, Brielle began researching Rashid with the systematic thoroughness that had served her well in academic settings, but felt almost absurd when applied to personal revenge fantasies. Her laptop screen glowed in the darkness as she compiled a comprehensive profile of his business empire, his public statements, his charitable foundations, and his acquisition strategies. What she discovered was both impressive and deeply disturbing. A pattern of predatory practices that destroyed smaller companies through a combination of legal manipulation, financial pressure, and strategic patience. The Austin startup he'd discussed with Crawford was just the latest in a series of acquisitions that followed identical patterns, each one leaving behind empty office buildings and unemployed innovators, while adding billions to Rashid's personal fortune. The business articles painted him as a visionary disruptor who understood global markets better than his competitors. But the deeper Brielle dug into financial filings and regulatory documents, the clearer it became that his success depended on exploiting legal loopholes and regulatory blind spots that more ethical companies wouldn't touch. His Middle Eastern connections provided him with access to investment capital that came with fewer oversight requirements than American sources. And his ability to navigate between different legal systems allowed him to structure deals in ways that maximized profit while minimizing accountability. The Austin acquisition appeared to involve several techniques that skirted the edges of securities law, particularly around insider information and market manipulation that would be difficult to prove but clearly violated the spirit of fair competition. The irony of her situation wasn't lost on Brielle as she compiled evidence of Rashid's questionable business practices while facing financial ruin for the crime of defending her own dignity. She had the education to understand exactly how he was breaking the law, the language skills to interpret his private conversations, and the analytical training to recognize patterns that would escape most observers. But she also had rent due in 2 weeks, student loans that wouldn't pause for moral outrage, and a checking account that contained exactly $347 after paying for groceries and subway fare. Knowledge without power was just another form of torture, and watching billionaires break laws with impunity while she faced homelessness for speaking Arabic was a masterclass in the fundamental unfairness of American capitalism. The email notification arrived at 11:37 p.m. with the cheerful chime that her laptop used for important messages, cutting through her spiral of anger and self-pity like a lighthouse beam through fog. Dr. Samantha Rhodes from the International Economic Forum was writing to confirm her acceptance for a consulting presentation at their upcoming conference on global business ethics and cultural sensitivity in international commerce. The opportunity had emerged from a speculative application she'd submitted 2 months ago, back when she'd still believed that credentials and expertise might eventually translate into career advancement. The timing felt like either cosmic irony or divine intervention, depending on her philosophical perspective, but the practical implications were undeniable. She would be presenting her research on Middle Eastern business practices to an audience of international executives, policymakers, and financial journalists exactly 1 week before Rashid delivered his keynote address on expanding tech ventures across cultural boundaries. The consulting fee was modest but meaningful, enough to cover her rent and buy her time to find new employment. But more importantly, the conference represented a platform where her voice might actually matter. Dr. Rhodes had specifically requested her presentation on cultural sensitivity and ethical considerations in cross-border business relationships, a topic that suddenly felt less academic and more personally urgent than it had when she'd originally proposed it. As Brielle stared at the email confirming her participation, she felt something shift inside her chest from despair to possibility. The glass had broken, her job was gone, and her financial situation was precarious. But perhaps that meant she had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. The real battle wasn't over. It was just beginning on a much larger stage. The International Economic Forum occupied 3 floors of the Javits Center, transforming the cavernous space into a temporary cathedral of global commerce where policymakers, business leaders, and academic researchers gathered to debate the future of international trade. Dr. Samantha Rhodes had built the conference from nothing over 15 years, establishing it as the premier venue for serious discussions about economic policy, cultural sensitivity, and ethical business practices. At 47, she possessed the rare combination of academic credibility and practical experience that commanded respect from both university professors and Fortune 500 executives. And her invitation list read like a who's who of international finance and diplomatic relations. The fact that she'd accepted Brielle's presentation proposal suggested either exceptional timing or remarkable insight into the relevance of cultural competency in global business strategy. Brielle's preparation for the presentation became an exercise in controlled obsession, transforming her tiny studio apartment into a war room where academic research met personal vendetta in ways that would have horrified her Georgetown professors. She surrounded herself with printed articles, regulatory documents, financial reports, and cultural analysis papers, creating a 3-dimensional map of Rashid's business empire that revealed patterns invisible to casual observers. Her diplomatic training had taught her to analyze international relationships through multiple lenses simultaneously, and applying those skills to a single businessman's career trajectory was like using a telescope to examine a grain of sand. The level of detail was almost overwhelming, but it was also revealing crucial insights about how cultural assumptions could be weaponized for financial gain. The research confirmed her worst suspicions about the Austin startup acquisition, revealing a complex web of financial manipulation that exploited both American securities law and international banking regulations. Rashid's strategy involved creating artificial market pressures through shell companies registered in multiple jurisdictions, then offering rescue financing that came with terms designed to gradually transfer intellectual property rights from the original founders to his umbrella corporation. The techniques were sophisticated enough to avoid triggering automatic regulatory reviews, but they clearly violated the spirit of fair competition that international trade agreements were designed to protect. More importantly, for Brielle's purposes, several aspects of the scheme depended on the assumption that American regulators wouldn't recognize certain Middle Eastern financial structures, precisely the kind of cultural blind spot that her presentation was designed to address. The moral implications of using her academic platform for personal revenge kept Brielle awake during the long nights leading up to the conference, staring at her ceiling while wrestling with questions that hadn't been covered in any Georgetown ethics seminar. Her research was legitimate. Her analysis was sound, and her conclusions about cultural sensitivity in international business were academically defensible. But her motivation was undeniably personal and potentially compromising. The line between scholarly investigation and targeted harassment was thinner than she'd expected, and crossing it could destroy her credibility in academic and diplomatic circles before her career had even begun. Yet the alternative was allowing Rashid to continue exploiting his cultural advantages while destroying companies built by people who lacked his connections and ruthlessness. Dr. Rhodes's follow-up email arrived with news that shifted the stakes beyond anything Brielle had imagined. The conference's original keynote speaker had withdrawn due to a family emergency, and would Brielle be interested in expanding her presentation to fill the newly available time slot immediately before Rashid's address on international expansion strategies? The irony was so perfect it felt like fictional coincidence, but the practical implications were staggering. Instead of presenting to a small breakout session of academic specialists, she would be addressing the full conference audience of over 800 attendees, including financial journalists, regulatory officials, and business leaders who possessed the authority to act on any concerns she might raise about unethical practices in international commerce. The expanded presentation timeline allowed Brielle to develop her analysis into something approaching a comprehensive case study, though she was careful to maintain academic neutrality by avoiding direct accusations or specific company names. Her diplomatic training had taught her the art of saying dangerous things in safe language, and she applied those skills to construct a presentation that appeared to offer general observations about cultural competency while actually providing a detailed blueprint for recognizing and preventing exactly the kind of manipulation Rashid employed in his business dealings. The techniques she described were presented as hypothetical examples based on composite research, but anyone familiar with recent Middle Eastern tech acquisitions would recognize the patterns immediately. The night before the conference, Brielle stood before her bathroom mirror practicing the Arabic phrases she intended to weave into her presentation, ensuring that her pronunciation remained flawless under pressure. The language skills that had made her invisible at Celestial would become her secret weapon at the Javits Center, allowing her to demonstrate cultural competency in ways that would surprise and possibly intimidate an audience accustomed to American business insularity. She'd carefully structured her remarks to showcase her linguistic abilities naturally, as part of her academic analysis rather than as a personal attack. But the subtext would be unmistakable to anyone who'd ever dismissed her intelligence based on superficial assumptions about service workers and their educational backgrounds. As she reviewed her notes one final time, Brielle reflected on how much had changed since that night at Celestial when crystal had shattered against marble and her professional facade had finally cracked under pressure. The glass had broken, but perhaps that destruction had been necessary to reveal what lay underneath. Not a desperate waitress clinging to employment, but a scholar with dangerous knowledge and the platform to deploy it. Tomorrow, she would step onto a stage where her voice actually mattered, where her education and expertise would be recognized and valued, where she could speak truth to power in a language that power would be forced to understand. The real question wasn't whether she was prepared for the opportunity, but whether Rashid was prepared for what she intended to reveal. The Javits Center buzzed with the contained energy of 800 ambitious people networking with surgical precision, their conversations creating a symphony of deal-making, information trading, and strategic alliance formation that echoed through the vast exhibition halls. Brielle arrived 90 minutes before her presentation, dressed in her only professional suit, a charcoal gray ensemble she'd purchased for job interviews that had never materialized, and carrying the leather portfolio her parents had given her for graduation. Her Georgetown credentials were displayed on the conference badge hanging around her neck, along with her official title as International Business Consultant, a designation that felt both accurate and aspirational depending on how generously one defined consultant. The transformation from invisible waitress to featured speaker felt surreal, but she'd learned to inhabit different versions of herself depending on circumstances, and today she was Dr. Brielle Cassidy, Middle Eastern business specialist and cultural competency expert. Cameron Sterling approached her during the pre-presentation networking session with the confident stride of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in any room. The legal consultant had built his reputation by identifying regulatory vulnerabilities before they became headline scandals, and his client list included several Fortune 500 companies that paid premium fees for his ability to navigate the gray areas between legal compliance and ethical responsibility. At 40 years old, he possessed the sharp-edged charm of a prosecutor turned defense attorney, someone who understood both sides of corporate law well enough to exploit the weaknesses in either position. His interest in Brielle's presentation suggested either professional curiosity about cultural competency issues or something more specific and potentially useful for her ultimate objectives. Rashid's entrance into the networking area created a subtle shift in the room's energy, conversations pausing momentarily as heads turned to acknowledge the presence of genuine celebrity wealth. He moved through the space with the unconscious authority of someone worth more than most small nations, his custom suit and Swiss timepiece serving as silent announcements of his financial significance. James Crawford accompanied him. Their relationship now shifted from potential partnership to confirmed collaboration following their successful negotiation of the Austin acquisition terms. Brielle watched from across the room as Rashid accepted congratulations and business cards with the practiced grace of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any gathering, his smile never quite reaching his eyes as he calculated the value of each interaction. The moment when Rashid noticed Brielle was electric with mutual recognition and completely different interpretations of what that recognition meant. She saw him pause mid-conversation, his expression shifting from polite attention to confused surprise as his brain processed the incongruity of seeing his former waitress wearing professional attire and displaying academic credentials in an environment where she clearly didn't belong. His recovery was swift, but not quite swift enough to hide his initial shock, and she watched him lean toward Crawford to make some quiet observation that caused both men to glance in her direction with expressions that mixed amusement with disdain. The Arabic words were too quiet for her to hear clearly across the crowded room, but his body language suggested he was sharing the amusing coincidence of encountering delusional service staff who'd somehow gained access to a professional conference. Dr. Samantha Rhodes materialized beside Brielle with the efficient warmth of someone who'd spent 15 years managing academic personalities and corporate egos with equal skill. The conference director's presence provided both protection and validation, establishing Brielle's legitimacy in ways that her credentials alone couldn't achieve in a room full of skeptical business leaders. Their conversation about presentation logistics was interrupted by Rashid's approach, his movement across the room as deliberate and calculated as a chess master positioning pieces for an inevitable victory. He introduced himself to Dr. Rhodes with the polished charm of someone accustomed to being recognized and courted, then turned to Brielle with an expression that managed to convey both surprise and condescension in a single raised eyebrow. The exchange that followed was a masterclass in passive-aggressive power dynamics, with Rashid expressing elaborate surprise at encountering his former server in such distinguished company while simultaneously questioning how someone with her background had gained access to a forum designed for serious international business professionals. His tone remained perfectly polite throughout, but the subtext was clear. She was an imposter who'd somehow infiltrated a gathering where she didn't belong, and her presence was an embarrassment that reflected poorly on the conference's screening procedures. Dr. Rhodes's diplomatic intervention prevented the conversation from escalating beyond subtle insults, but the battle lines were clearly drawn between Rashid's assumptions about social hierarchy and Brielle's determination to prove that intelligence and expertise couldn't be judged by employment history. As the networking session concluded and speakers prepared for their presentations, Brielle overheard Rashid speaking to his associates in Arabic about his plans to educate the little waitress about the difference between serving food and understanding international business. His confidence was absolute, his dismissal complete, and his assumption that she remained as linguistically invisible as she'd been at Celestial was about to become his most expensive mistake. She'd spent weeks preparing for this moment, researching not just his business practices, but his psychological profile, his public statements, and his pattern of underestimating opponents based on superficial characteristics. The glass had shattered at Celestial, but today she would prove that what emerged from that destruction was something far more dangerous than a clumsy waitress with hurt feelings. Cameron Sterling caught her attention as the networking session dispersed, his expression suggesting that he'd observed the interaction between Brielle and Rashid with professional interest. His business card appeared in her hand with a subtle gesture, accompanied by a quiet suggestion that they continue their conversation after her presentation, particularly if she planned to discuss any specific examples of cultural insensitivity in international business practices. The implication was clear. He recognized that her academic presentation might have practical legal applications, and his expertise in regulatory compliance could prove valuable if certain hypothetical business practices turned out to be less hypothetical than they appeared. As Brielle tucked the card into her portfolio, she realized that she wasn't the only person in the room who'd been waiting for someone to challenge Rashid's carefully constructed empire of privilege and exploitation. The auditorium fell silent as Brielle approached the podium, 800 pairs of eyes tracking her movement across the stage with the collective attention that significant money commands when it gathers in one place. The spotlight was harsh and bright, transforming her charcoal suit into armor and her Georgetown credentials into weapons she'd been waiting years to deploy in anger. Behind her, a massive screen displayed the first slide of her presentation: Cultural Competency and Ethical Considerations in Cross-Border Business Relationships. The academic language carefully chosen to sound boring enough to avoid scrutiny while being specific enough to draw blood. She could see Rashid in the third row, his expression radiating the confident amusement of someone preparing to watch an amateur embarrass herself in front of serious professionals, completely unaware that his own destruction was about to begin with scholarly precision. The opening minutes of her presentation followed standard academic protocols, establishing her credentials through a careful recitation of her Georgetown education, her diplomatic training, her language proficiencies, and her research into Middle Eastern business practices and cultural norms. The audience listened with polite attention, checking their phones and reviewing their notes while she laid the intellectual foundation for what was to come. But Brielle could feel the energy in the room shifting as she began to weave Arabic phrases naturally into her analysis, demonstrating not just theoretical knowledge, but practical fluency that surprised business leaders accustomed to American linguistic insularity. Each perfectly pronounced word was a small revelation, establishing her cultural competency in ways that transcended academic credentials and entered the realm of lived experience. The case study she presented was a masterpiece of academic passive aggression, describing hypothetical scenarios that anyone familiar with recent Middle Eastern tech acquisitions would recognize immediately while maintaining enough fictional distance to avoid direct accusations of wrongdoing. She outlined a pattern of predatory business practices that exploited cultural assumptions, regulatory blind spots, and the inherent advantages that came with operating across multiple legal jurisdictions simultaneously. The techniques she described were sophisticated, profitable, and potentially illegal, depending on how aggressively prosecutors wanted to interpret securities law and international trade agreements. The audience leaned forward as the implications became clear. She wasn't just discussing theoretical problems, but providing a roadmap for recognizing and preventing specific forms of financial manipulation. Halfway through her presentation, Brielle noticed Rashid's expression beginning to change from amused dismissal to uncomfortable recognition as the parallels between her hypothetical case study and his actual business practices became impossible to ignore. His conversation with James Crawford at Celestial had provided her with specific details about the Austin acquisition that weren't public knowledge, and she'd woven those details into her academic analysis in ways that demonstrated intimate familiarity with techniques that most scholars could only describe in theoretical terms. The legal implications were staggering. If her hypothetical scenarios matched real business practices closely enough, her presentation could trigger regulatory investigations that would scrutinize deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The moment when everything crystallized came during the question and answer session, when Rashid himself stood to challenge her analysis with the confident authority of someone who'd built an empire through exactly the practices she was critiquing. His question was phrased as intellectual curiosity about her source materials, but the subtext was clear. He was demanding to know how a former waitress had gained access to confidential business information, and whether her academic credentials were sufficient to justify her presence on such a distinguished platform. The challenge was delivered in English with just enough condescension to establish his position as the adult in the conversation, someone with real-world experience correcting theoretical misunderstandings from inexperienced academics who'd never negotiated actual international business deals. Brielle's response began in perfect Arabic, the words flowing with the fluency of someone who'd spent 2 years studying in Cairo and countless hours practicing diplomatic language for exactly this type of high-stakes conversation. She thanked him for his question, acknowledged his obvious expertise in international business expansion, and then systematically dismantled his challenge by revealing that her source materials included direct observation of confidential business discussions conducted in languages that the participants assumed were private. The audience gasped as the implications registered. She'd been present during actual business planning sessions, had understood conversations that weren't intended for her ears, and possessed evidence of practices that might violate securities regulations and international trade agreements. The final blow came when Brielle activated the voice recording app on her phone, playing back crucial segments of the conversation she'd overheard at Celestial between Rashid and Crawford. The audio quality was excellent. The Arabic translations were provided in real time, and the content was devastating. Detailed planning for market manipulation, insider trading coordination, and systematic exploitation of regulatory loopholes that would destroy a family-owned business while generating massive profits for investors who understood how to weaponize cultural assumptions against less sophisticated competitors. The recording captured not just illegal business practices, but the racist assumptions and casual cruelty that motivated them, revealing Rashid's character in ways that no amount of philanthropic public relations could rehabilitate. As the presentation concluded and the audience erupted in conversations that mixed shock, admiration, and careful calculation of the legal and financial implications they'd just witnessed, Brielle stood at the podium feeling the weight of 3 months' accumulated humiliation transforming into something approaching justice. Rashid sat frozen in his seat, his confident amusement replaced by the pallor of someone watching his carefully constructed empire begin to crumble in real time. The glass had shattered at Celestial, but what emerged from that destruction wasn't broken fragments, but a weapon sharp enough to cut through privilege, assumptions, and the arrogant certainty that intelligence could be judged by employment history. The battle was over, but the War Crimes Tribunal was just beginning. The aftermath of Brielle's presentation unfolded like a controlled demolition, with consequences radiating outward through Manhattan's financial district at the speed of secure email and encrypted phone calls. Within hours, the voice recording had been transcribed, translated, and forwarded to the Securities and Exchange Commission, where investigators who specialized in international market manipulation recognized several techniques that warranted immediate attention. Cameron Sterling had moved with the efficiency of someone who'd been waiting years for exactly this type of evidence, his legal expertise translating Brielle's academic analysis into regulatory language that would survive prosecutorial scrutiny and judicial review. The Austin startup's founders received their first hint of salvation when federal investigators contacted them about unusual trading patterns in their company's stock, patterns that suggested sophisticated market manipulation by parties with access to confidential information. The financial journalism community descended on the story with a feeding frenzy that only occurred when academic research intersected with billionaire scandals and federal investigations simultaneously. Brielle found herself fielding interview requests from the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, and 3 major television networks, all seeking expert commentary on cultural competency in international business and the regulatory implications of her research findings. The Georgetown Alumni magazine wanted to feature her as a success story, completely unaware that 6 weeks ago she'd been suspended from a restaurant job for speaking Arabic to a customer who'd assumed she was too stupid to understand his insults. The transformation from invisible waitress to celebrated whistleblower felt surreal, but she was learning to inhabit this new version of herself with the same adaptive skills that had helped her survive 3 months in Celestial's dining room. Rashid's empire began cracking along the fault lines that Brielle's presentation had revealed to regulatory authorities, with investigators discovering that the Austin acquisition was just the most recent example of practices that extended back years through dozens of similar deals. His company's stock price dropped 37% in the first week following the conference, as investors recalculated the value of business strategies that depended on exploiting regulatory blind spots that were no longer blind. The SEC investigation expanded to include his company's board of directors, their compliance procedures, and their oversight of international transactions that might have violated American securities law. James Crawford's investment firm quietly withdrew from several pending deals while their legal team reviewed the implications of their association with practices that could trigger criminal liability rather than just civil penalties. The job offers began arriving before Brielle had finished processing the psychological whiplash of her sudden transformation from economic desperation to professional opportunity. 3 major diplomatic consulting firms expressed interest in her expertise in Middle Eastern business practices and cultural competency analysis, offering salaries that would eliminate her student loans and provide the financial security she'd been pursuing since graduation. The State Department reached out about consulting opportunities that could lead to permanent positions in international trade regulation, exactly the kind of diplomatic career she'd dreamed of building when she'd chosen her Georgetown major 4 years earlier. The irony wasn't lost on her that losing her restaurant job had ultimately created the circumstances that launched the career she'd been trying to build through conventional applications and networking. Dr. Samantha Rhodes invited her to co-author an academic paper on cultural sensitivity in international business regulation, a collaboration that would establish her credentials in ways that years of conventional scholarship might not have achieved. The research would examine how cultural assumptions could be weaponized for financial manipulation, using her conference presentation as a case study in identifying and preventing such practices through improved regulatory oversight and cross-cultural educational requirements for international business licenses. The academic credibility would complement her consulting opportunities and television appearances, creating a platform where her voice would matter in policy discussions about international trade regulation and cultural competency requirements for global business operations. 6 weeks after her presentation, Brielle returned to Celestial not as an employee seeking shifts, but as a customer hosting a business dinner for potential clients interested in her consulting services on Middle Eastern market expansion strategies. The restaurant looked smaller than she remembered, its opulent decor feeling somehow theatrical rather than intimidating, as if she'd grown large enough to see through the illusions that had once impressed her with their significance. Trevor Hamilton greeted her with the deferential warmth reserved for valued customers, his recognition of her transformation complete but unmentioned, both of them understanding that acknowledging their previous relationship would be professionally awkward for everyone involved. Kendall Brooks was 21 years old and working her way through business school at NYU. Her situation so similar to Brielle's former circumstances that watching her serve water and take orders felt like observing her own past through a telescope. The young woman moved with the same careful precision that Brielle remembered from her own months of invisibility, maintaining pleasant professionalism while navigating the complex social dynamics of serving people who possessed more money than she could imagine earning in her lifetime. When Kendall apologized for a minor delay with the wine service, Brielle responded with the kind of patience and respect that she'd never received during her own time behind Celestial's tables, creating a small moment of human dignity in a space designed to reinforce economic hierarchies. The conversation with her consulting clients flowed smoothly through courses of expertly prepared food and carefully selected wine, their discussion of international business opportunities punctuated by Kendall's professional service and Brielle's conscious efforts to treat her with the recognition she deserved as a fellow human being pursuing her own dreams under difficult circumstances. As the evening concluded and Brielle signed the check that would have represented 2 weeks of her former salary, she reflected on the strange mathematics of justice and opportunity, the way that breaking glass could sometimes reveal possibilities that remained invisible as long as everything stayed perfectly intact. The restaurant's marble floors still gleamed under ambient lighting. The wealthy patrons still conducted their important conversations in assumed privacy, and somewhere in the city, new servers were learning to be invisible while dreaming of the day when someone would finally see them clearly enough to recognize their worth.